Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here with Semaj Brown.
Hi there. How are you? So good to be here, Ethan.
I'm
Thank you
good.
for inviting me.
All right. We can get straight into the questions. Uh, so first of all, something I ask basically everyone I talk to is, how did you fall in love with poetry? What did they kind of look like? And why did you end up writing it instead of just reading it?
I fell in love with poetry when I was a child. Actually, I say my mother turned me into a poem. We read poetry almost every night or every other night. And I read a variety of poetry. I read Broadside Press poetry. Broadside Press is the oldest historical publishing company of African American poets in the United States. And so in 1965, Dudley Randall established Broadside Press. And so at that time, I was reading Broadside Press poets like Sonia Sanchez, Hakeem Mahabuti, and Gwendolyn Brooks, and so many others. And I was reading other poetry as well. My mother had a poetry book of 19th century poetry, European poetry. I was reading that. I was also reading Byron and all of those, the romantic poets. And so poetry was a part of my childhood. Just thought it was very, very normal. Didn't know it was extraordinary.
Yeah. And kind of following up on that, why do you think at least you were drawn to writing it too? Because it sounds like you clearly had a lot of experience reading it.
Well, that's a good question. I wrote my first poem, I was about probably 5, and it was about a fly. It was just a little poem about by fly and so forth. But by the time I was in the second grade, um, I really wrote a serious poem about the Vietnam War. And it was war is a bad thing. It is also a sad thing. You look out to the field and many bodies lay still. Next thing you know, you're attending to someone's will. And you look out to the field and all the bodies lay still. And it went on and on. And I gave it to my second grade teacher, and she was astounded, and she said, "Oh my goodness." So she put it on this large paper, and we put it in the hallway in one of those display cases. And we would, have little lines going to the lavatory and so forth. They'd line the children up, and I would look at it, and I said, "That's my poem." So it came because I think the best thing to do if you want to be a writer of poetry is to read poetry. Read a great deal of poetry. And I think it will evoke the poetry that's inherent in all of us. And so I think it had to do with me reading just copious amounts of poems.
Yeah. And kind of following off of that, when you wrote your poetry, I mean, you already kind of gave us a little bit of insight of what you started out writing about,
Yeah.
but how do you think that kind of evolved? And I guess now, what do you think is generally the kind of themes that you write about?
Well, it did evolve because, and what happened, I didn't continue writing poetry from the second grade on. Um, I was a music student, and so I studied the violin. So the violin was very much a part of my development. It informed my poetry. I studied Vivaldi a great deal and Baroque music, and I played in a chamber orchestra. So I wasn't writing during that time, I was playing. When I stopped playing and I started to write again, the poetry I was writing was it was informed by the music. I also listened to a great deal of what they call jazz, Thelonious Monk, Duke Ellington, and on. So my poetry was very lyrical. And now that was in my early 20s. And now my poetry, and you're finding your voice and you're developing your voice all the time and refining it. That's, it's part of the whole process of art being a dynamic process. So now the content of what I write about is mostly social justice, environmental injustice, women's equity, and love. I love to write about love. It's what makes, it's, it's a balance. I can't write about all these hard things and not have love. And since I'm in love with my husband, it's easy. And it's easy. It's like a spring.
Yeah. I mean, I see the different aspects of what you write about as very much in tune with each other, because it really is about that kind of balance between you write about things that you feel called to write about, and you write
Yes.
about things that feel as they are indulgences to write about. And I think both of them equally deserve a place in your kind of repertoire if you're going to kind of be happy as a poet.
Yes, you don't want to be depressed. I mean, because when I was coming up, there was an idea that the poet was always brooding and always, almost on the verge of depression, and very eccentric and almost mad, So thank goodness that's no more. That was a kind of a stereotype, right? So we've left that stereotype. That was probably the 60s stereotype of the brooding, depressed, you have to be miserable poet in order to write. But you don't have to be miserable, but you can write about miserable, horrible, terrible things. But poetry also is used to help people that are having difficulty. You can write it out. Once it gets on the page, it's a way to express, and sometimes through that expression there's healing that takes place, or at least regeneration. There's regenerative work being done. That's what I'll say instead of healing.
Yeah.
Healing is overused. It's a cliche.
Yeah. And not to myself be cliche, but that's definitely been the case for me in the past as well. Just being able to use poetry has helped me through whatever it might have been, just putting a name to it in some cases.
Yes, very
And
important. Especially in this culture, we're a naming culture. To name things. All places don't have this propensity toward labeling and naming and calling something what it is and defining it. Some places, it depends on the culture, they're able to contextualize things without naming them. It's a different way of understanding.
Yeah. And we talked a little about these things that you write about.
Yeah.
So I was just curious about what are the specifics in how you get inspired to write about these kinds of things, like events that happen to you, things you read, or stuff like that.
I would say of particularly my major pieces, I'm going to venture 82% of my work is delivered through dreams. And so I dream the work. It's not good sleep hygiene because, it enters into my imagination or my subconscious mind when I'm asleep. And so there, beside my bed, there's a little nightstand, a little writing table. If I can shoo it away so I can continue to sleep, I will. If I can't, then I will write a little note. Sometimes that will work and I may return to slumber. But often it's a torment and I must wake up, go to the computer or get a notebook and write this down. These are major works. And so they do come through for me subconsciously. Then I start the process of which is very conscious. I'm using my frontal lobe to edit, to arrange, rearrange, decide what form. In fact, form is very important to me. What form is this poem going to take? Structure. And there's this question sometimes about do you use form or do you use content? And does the content inform the structure or vice versa? And so for me, structure is very, very important. It will almost tell me about the poem. If I'm writing about music, oftentimes, depending on the type of music it is, then the structure will reflect that. So the structure may have pizzicato throughout it. It may have so that would be short words, repetition in certain places, because I'm writing about music, so the structure is going to reflect music.
Yeah, that kind of interests me because you mentioned editing. And what do you think are some of the takeaways of how, like the main takeaways of your best editing practices, I guess I would ask?
Going away, leaving it, do something else. Kind of cleanse your brain palette with just like if you were eating a meal and you wanted to cleanse your palate so that you could get the essence of the next meal, the next course. You do that with your brain as well. You want to do something totally different. Give yourself a break. Go listen to some music that's unrelated, or look at something totally unrelated. Have a conversation, have some fun, do something else, do some work. So when you return to the work, you're fresh and your eyes are fresh and you're looking at it. And when you see it through that lens, oh, the things you can see. And usually I'm so grateful that I did not submit this somewhere or read it, because it needed editing. And so it's about discipline. For me, it's like, oh, I'm so excited once the poem is on the page and I feel like I'm finished, but I'm not finished. I'm never finished the first time I feel finished, ever. And I always, this is interesting. Now that we're talking, I always feel finished when that poem is on the page, but it's never finished. I have many drafts, editing. And then you have to know when to stop, of course. I've seen poets, pick out a poem, pick out a word forever. They don't know when to let it go. When is it done? When is it finished?
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I mean, I definitely see myself in that. I sometimes will finish a poem and then I'll be like, oh, this is great. This is so good. And then kind of out of almost hubris, I like show it to someone and then they're like, I have no idea what is going on in this poem. And then I look at it again myself and I'm like, you're right. I also no longer have any idea what is going on in this poem.
Exactly. Yes, it happened to me the other day. I felt so positive about this and I knew exactly what I was saying. And I read it to a friend of mine. She said, I'm sorry, Semaj. This is beyond what I can comprehend. And she's a brilliant person. So I went and looked at it and I thought, oh, this is very obtuse and it's very abstract. And you have to give people something to hold on to sometimes. So you have to go back into that poem and give them markers that they can capture, unless you just want to have an abstract poem. Now, if that is the purpose, to have a poem that elicits feeling and people don't have a positioning about it, well, then it was a successful poem. Because those poems are successful as well. All poems aren't, some are supposed to be deliberately obtuse and vague, and so that people wander and don't know what really is going on. They're a little uncomfortable, and that might be the purpose. But that wasn't the purpose of this poem I wrote. I wanted people to know what I was saying, and it was it was too expressionistic. Mhm.
Mhm. And I think I'll ask one last question before we get into a reading of your poem, which is, what would you say is good advice for someone just starting with poetry?
Well, I think I'm doing a project now called Flint Reads Poetry, Poetry Voices of Flint. I'm developing a virtual poetry gallery. And I'm working with Zeta, Beta, Zeta. And what those members are doing, they're just reading the poems of the Harlem Renaissance. And so then we're going to put them in a virtual poetry gallery so that anybody can listen to them. I think it's important to hear poetry read or have someone read it to you, or you read it yourself. It's so to get started is to read poetry or to listen to poetry, because it really is, a sister to music. If not, the words are notes. And that's the way I perceive it, probably because of my music background. So when I finished undergraduate, she said, "Where's your violin? Why aren't you playing your violin?" I said, "I'm playing poetry now. I'm writing poetry." And so the notes became instead of the notes, I have words. And so I would suggest that people read poetry and listen to poetry, all types of poetry. Don't get stuck in one area. All types, everything. And there'll be something that will catch a person's fancy more than others, and then the person will go venture more into that area. You'll speak to them. So that's where I would get started, by listening to poetry and reading poetry. And now that we have the internet, I know you've always had the internet, but it didn't exist for me growing up. But now that we have the internet, you can just Google any poet or Google poetry all over the world and listen to it and just really be amazed and inspired. There was a question. I took a note on it. Poetry is so special because it captures the essence of things. It's the absolute most condensed and intense way of seeing a situation or feeling a situation. Poetry is able to do that, offer another perspective, and really it's very piercing. So that's one of the reasons why I think poetry is so important to the world, because after a while, the way we speak and ordinary standard narrative becomes mundane, and we can't hear one another. But if you're speaking poetry, I can hear you. I will listen, because it's very sharp and tuned. It goes right through everything.
Yeah. Something definitely is special about poetry. There's simultaneously a lot more freedom with it than other forms, it feels, in the way that you can just be honest about things. But of course, there is like the length and content kind of limitation you have, because it is supposed to be shorter form than if you could write a whole book about this one thing, or if you could write a whole article about it.
Right. And a poet is able to take that article. In fact, I exercise with students where we take a standard narrative, and then we take that standard narrative, might be some allegory, a story, and then we turn it into a poem. Just grab it and just keep shrinking it and condensing it and getting the essence out of it until we have a poem that is a reflection of this allegory, which is really a nice exercise. It really is.
Yeah. If you're ready, we can get into the poem reading now.
All righty. So I'm going to be reading a poem called Black Dandelion. It was published in The Power of Goodness. This is the Poet Laureate of North Carolina, Jackie Shelton Green, asked me to submit, and she's one of the editors along with Timothy Crowley. So it's called Black Dandelion. Age 4, witness my first mow down. Twinkling ground stars cut by murderous lawnmower. Feeling the blade, I fell, curled like a snail in grief. 12 full moons folded into spring. Perennial promises prevailed. Bees celebrated the return of dandelions in a skirt of twirling yellow bliss. Flowering bouffants mirrored my spiky little afro. Jagged-edged lion's tooth leaves pay tribute to my snagger-tooth smile. Me and my freedom fighting flowers frolicked to survive the scissoring, the updigging, poisoning. Warning signs hovered like low-hanging clouds. No blooming allowed. Blossoms will be prosecuted. These brave plants grew just for me. Grew in spite of a society that favored a monochromatic landscape. 1965. Mr. Brother Malcolm X was assassinated. Assassinated, big word for a pre-kindergartner. I was convinced he must have been a dandelion. Reverend King too, and the Johnson boy who lived one turn down the street, that way. The Johnson boy was shot by the police for growing in a monochromatic landscape. Training wheels off, bike riding across the insecure cement. I pedaled the bumpy path, waving solidarity to each surviving sunburst noggin, each fulfilling the promise to ornament lawns and flourish souls with lemon drop hope. Dandelions bear art of endurance and escape, transforming into pearl puffs, floating with ephemeral intention, carrying the spirit of the weed. 13 full moons faded into July. I am a proud weed. Yes, I declared that shocking proclamation standing in the pulpit on Youth Sunday, Vernon Chapel AME Church. I added to my speech on David and Goliath, my impromptu improvisation of dandelion dogma. We are Black dandelions who will never be destroyed. We grow the power of goodness for generations into the future. I yet remember the hat-framed faces of the pious, the amused, and the mortified.
Thank you.
You have Black dandelion.
That was great. I loved your energy when reading the poem too. It really brought it out. And I definitely understand why you would say that poems need to be read to you sometimes.
It's great, wonderful. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for coming.
Well, certainly. Thank you for inviting me. I need to hear some of your poems, Ethan.
Yeah. I think I have some recordings of them online, but it's definitely not as energetic as your readings.
Pardon me?
They're definitely not as energetic as your readings.
Well, that's okay. They don't have to be energetic. Everything shouldn't be energetic.
All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me. You take great care and we'll be in touch.
Yeah.